Welcome back to the Offbit. Today we've got the Intel i5-2320. Now we've paired this with a Dell Inspiron 660 motherboard and we run a GTX 660. We're going to be playing some games and we're going to see how well it does on the benchmarks. So stick around and find out how we go. The Intel i5-2320 is a Sandy Bridge processor. Sandy Bridge is the successor to the Nalin microarchitecture. This i5-2320 was released on September 2011 as a later release for the i5 Sandy Bridge lineup. Other Sandy Bridge i5s were released as early as January 2011. The i5-2320 has 4 cores and 4 threads, with a base clock of 3 GHz and the ability to boost up to 3.3 GHz on one single core. The Sandy Bridge architecture is constructed on the 32nm manufacturing node, and our CPU is based on the LGA 1155 platform. Our i5-2320 has 6 meg of level 3 cache and has a TDP of 95 watts. Its recommended retail price at introduction was $177 USD. At the Offbit here, we have a soft spot for Sandy Bridge i5 and i7 CPUs. We feel that you can still find a lot of games that are still playable on this platform. However, we are going to put that to the test. The motherboard we have today has been pilfered from a Dell Inspiron 660. It also can be found in the Dell Vostro 270. This motherboard is the MIB75R/MH_SG. Based off the B75 chipset and supporting the LGA 1155 platform, supporting both 2nd and 3rd generation i3 and i5s. Dell does not mention support for the i7s, but it should with the latest BIOS update. But until we have an i7 that we can test with, we cannot confirm or deny this claim. This motherboard has 2 DIMM slots for DDR3, supporting 1333 or 1600. It has 1 X16 PCIe slot and 3 X1 PCIe slots, and also has a mini PCIe slot which was initially used for Wi-Fi by Dell. This motherboard comes with 4 SATA ports and also has a Gigabit Ethernet connector on the back. The USBs on the back of the motherboard, it has 2 USB 2.0 ports and 4 USB 3.0 ports. On the front, it can have 4 USB 2.0 ports. Now, 2 of these ports are used by Dell for the 8-in-1 card reader, but you should be able to use them as a standard USB header for a USB output on the front. The motherboard also has the standard audio jacks on the back and supports HDMI or VGA video through the CPU's integrated graphics. The RAM we're using today is from Kingston. This is the KVR 1333 D39K2/8G. This is an 8GB kit comprising of 2 4GB sticks. The RAM is DDR3 and its speed is 1333 MHz. This is the NVIDIA GTX 660 from Gainward. NVIDIA released the GTX 660 back in September 2012. Based off the Kepler architecture, the GTX 660 GPU code is the GK106-400-A1. This GPU is based off the 28nm fabrication node. Our GPU has 2 GB of GDDR5 clocked at 1527 MHz and is based on a 192-bit bus. Our core clock is at 1006 MHz and can be boosted up to 1072 MHz. The GTX 660 supports the following APIs: Direct3D 11 but has functional Direct3D 12 support. It also supports OpenCL 1.2, OpenGL 4.6 and also Vulkan 1.1. This card comes with a GPU cooler that has 2 copper heat pipes and 1 single fan. This GTX 660 supports SLI and has 2 DVI connectors, 1 HDMI and 1 DisplayPort. Drives we're using today are the standard. We have one 120GB Western Digital Green SSD. We also have one 240GB Western Digital Green SSD, one 1TB magnetic Western Digital Green hard drive. Our operating systems we're using today is Windows 10 Build 2004. Our operating system is on the first 120GB Western Digital Green SSD. Great, let's see how this system runs with our benchmark tests. In our synthetic benchmark, our i5-2320 scored in 7-zip on a single core was 3,658 points. Sitting firmly in the middle with its single core scores, our multi-core score was 12,569 points. Leaving our CPU in multi-core score in third position, our single-core score sat pretty much down the middle of the pack, but most of these CPUs are pretty similar. In CPU ID CPU Z, the i5-2320 scored 317.2 points for its singles core score, and its multi-core score was 1,232 points. Once again, this benchmark puts us in third place for multi-core score, and the single core score was pretty much similar to all the other single core scores for all the CPUs in this benchmark. In 3D Mark's Cinebench R15, the i5-2320 scored 423 points, putting this firmly in third place. Now the benchmarks did show us what we basically knew already. The i5-2320 is the second gen i5, sat behind the third gen i5 and in front of the first gen i5, the 760. And for the i7-950, we always beat it in the single core because it's a first gen i7. But that hyper-threading did push it out in front with the third generation and second gen i5s. Staying with Cinebench R15, our GTX 660 on the i5-2320 scored 67.58 frames. Now this is not a terribly great accurate benchmark. It does favour different systems, and this shows you how the i5-760 first gen holds back over the i5-2320 second gen. However, this effect happens in games as well, so it is actually a valid test to do. Though we always find the AMD cards or the Radeon cards do pretty well in this test, so just one thing to keep in mind anyway. In Unigine heaven, the GTX 660 Gamewood on the i5-2320 scored us 841 points. So first in the i5-760 with a different GTX 660, that was the Gigabyte one, that's an overclock. Now we just pushed out in front of it in Unigine heaven, so there's a bit of that CPU first gen, second gen i5 thing going on there. And finally, one of the most accurate tests, I believe, is 3D Mark's Firestrike. So as you can see, the i5-2320 with the GTX 660 from Gamewood scored 4,238 points. Now this is sitting behind the i5-760 with the GTX 60 overclock. Now this was the card that we did last week. Now it's from Gigabyte, so it has actually higher core clocks. It's got a higher boost clock as well, so it represents that in the data here. Now overall, our GTX 660 from Gamewoods is looking really good. Punching over the GTX 750, I think we got a good chance to play some games at some good frame rates. Now without further ado, our first game on our list is the action-adventure game Sea of Thieves. This fun and sometimes friendly multiplayer game can sink hours of your time if you happen to rally up the right crew of friends or strangers. That is, if you ever so dare to join an open crew. We played Sea of Thieves at 1920 by 1080 with low settings, or better known in this game as Cursed. Now, this game did suffer from load stutters, but mainly on your initial run around in the world at the start. It would also occasionally stutter during the loading of islands, some islands more so than others. However, it was not for a massive amount of time, and this was basically all the stutters we encountered while we were playing this game. Now, average frame rate for Sea of Thieves was 64.8 frames per second. Minimum frame rates were at 19.7 frames per second. Maximum frame rate hit 89.3 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows was 7.8 frames per second. Now, as all the metrics show, the game played really well. So all in all, this game on this system gave us a very enjoyable playable experience, with some minor load stutters at times during island loads. We would definitely give this game a thumbs up. Moving out to the Wild West, one of Rockstar's big titles, Red Dead Redemption 2. In Red Dead, we ran this game at 720p at low details using the Vulkan API. Now the game did not run amazing, but it did manage to keep a fairly consistent frame rate, which in our opinion makes this game more playable. Our frame rates gave us a more so console-like experience and did not give us any real load stutters or glitchy gameplay. Frame rates for Red Dead Redemption 2, average frame rate was 25.3 frames per second. Minimum frame rates hit 18.8 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate hit 34.7 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 15.4 frames per second. As the data shows, the frame rates managed to stay fairly consistent. This game was definitely playable, and once you got used to the frame rate, you found yourself getting immersed and enjoying yourself in this game. Now, we can't highly recommend this title on this system, but however, we can't say it's not good either. Now, we didn't get into any big gunfight battles, and we were a little bit concerned that maybe a gunfight battle may slow this game down. But anyway, if you're willing, give this game a go. It didn't run too bad. Moving into the 80-esque future, Cyberpunk 2077. We ran Cyberpunk at 1280 by 720p at low settings. Now, this game ran okay for the most of our gameplay. The game never saw any real high frame rates, and it did suffer from some dips. However, the game just had a small input delay, not major, just small, and it was enough to annoy us here at the Offbit. Now, the frame rates for Cyberpunk 2077, average frame rate was 29.3 frames per second. Minimum frame rate hit 12.8 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate hit 48.4 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 4.3 frames per second. Look, this game did run okay with a few dips, and we would say it's okay to play on this system if it wasn't for the small input lag that we experienced. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a great game to get immersed into, but it's a bit tricky when it's a little hard to aim or drive your vehicle just because of a small input delay. This may be because our CPU's just not quite cutting it, but I think this might just need a little bit more power on the GPU side of things. However, give it a go yourself and see what you find, and see if you're okay with the input lag. Covering our Battle Royale genre, we have PUBG. We ran PUBG at 1920 by 1080 with low details and using 100% rendering resolution. This game showed us generally a smooth and enjoyable gameplay. However, we did experience a gunfight where the game had a bit of a load stutter. Something like this could cost you your favorite keyboard or mouse if the battle does not go your way. And that's a fun anger management lesson, isn't it? Now, the frame rates for PUBG, average frame rate was 60.0 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate hit 24.5 frames per second. Maximum frame rate hit 84.6 frames per second. Our 0.1% low frame rate hit 2.0 frames per second. The data shows us an average 60 frames per second gaming experience, with some dips, but most of our gameplay was quite enjoyable. We would say this game is fine to play on this system, and maybe with some further graphics tweaking, you may make this game just run perfect. The CPU seemed for the most of it to keep up, except for the odd load-in here and there. A bit more graphics power may get this game over the line as well, but it played quite fine in its current system setup. Lastly, a classic Heroes Battle title, Blizzard's popular title, Overwatch. We generally find Blizzard games to run pretty good on low-end systems, so we were expecting pretty much smooth excellence on this system, in which Blizzard delivered. We ran Overwatch at 1920 by 1080 at medium settings. Now, our frame rates for Blizzard's Overwatch, average frame rates were 96.9 frames per second, minimum frame rates were 41.4 frames per second, maximum frame rate was 128.3 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows were 5.3 frames per second. Our frame rates show the game ran pretty much perfect, only dipping under 60 frames per second at times. We did have a low 0.1% low score, but this was from initial running around at the start as everything was still getting grabbed and loaded into memory. So naturally, Overwatch gets a very easy thumbs up for this system setup. Now, wrapping up this system today, we still feel that the second gen i5 2320 is still able to keep up and would definitely show better promise going towards some of the faster i5s from the Sandy Bridge range. The best thing about this platform is that if Sandy Bridge doesn't cut it, there's a good chance you can upgrade to an Ivy Bridge CPU, and also the options to go towards an i7 as well in either second or third gen CPUs. Though the i5 did start its life a lot more expensive in Australia than it does these days, you can now pick up these Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge CPUs as low as $20 or less. But most are under $50, making this a very viable, cheap platform to build and have some fun with. Now, in regards to the motherboards, there seems to be a vast amount of them, both offered from OEM or third-party manufacturers, like Gigabyte, Asus, etc. The platform itself did run for 2 generations of the CPU, and was very popular in many systems, from personal, private enterprise to government, which we believe should keep the second-hand market cheap for this platform for some time to come. The GTX 660, though this card is getting old, we believe this card still can find relevance in today's titles. However, you'll need to sacrifice game resolutions and graphic details. Moving up to a bigger card in this series like the GTX 670 would yield better results. However, You can find some GTX 660s in second-hand markets for as low as $25 in Australia, which can make it a great value video card. And if you are willing to make some sacrifices on graphic details, you can save some shiny pennies. Well, that's all we got today for the Offbit. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, please hit that like. Now, if you've got some suggestions you'd like to make, some games that you'd like us to test, or some hardware to look at, we might be able to help you with that. But please, leave a comment. We love reading it. We love trying to help you guys out. Now, if you really like this content and you want to see more of this content, hit that subscribe button. Now, if you want to see what we are working on or any future video previews, come and check out our Twitter page. Now, you can go to this URL here. It is also down the bottom in the description. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time on The Offbit.